If you've ever found yourself loving someone who pulls away just when things start to feel real, you already know how confusing it can feel. One moment they are close, warm, even deeply connected, and the next they retreat into silence, distance, and emotional walls you can't seem to climb. And in that moment, most people make the same mistake. They assume distance means disinterest. They assume pulling away means the connection is fading. But what if I told you that in many cases, it's actually the opposite? What if the very thing you think is breaking the connection is actually the thing that determines whether it deepens? Because here's something most people never understand about emotionally avoidant patterns. They don't run from love itself. They run from the feeling of losing themselves inside it. And so when someone like this starts to feel something real, something steady, something unfamiliar, their first instinct isn't to move closer, it's to step back. Not because you did something wrong, but because their nervous system is trying to recalibrate what closeness means. Now here's where it gets powerful, because the way you respond in that moment becomes the difference between pushing them further away or becoming the one person they can't stop coming back to. Most people panic, they text more, they explain more, they chase clarity from someone who is not emotionally available in that moment. And without realizing it, they shift from being a presence of calm love into a source of pressure. But pressure doesn't create safety. And without safety, there is no emotional surrender. The truth is, the avoidant doesn't need you to prove your love harder. They need you to embody it more peacefully. When you stay grounded while they pull back, when you don't chase, but you also don't punish, when you remain warm but not desperate, something subtle but powerful happens inside them. They start to associate you with emotional safety instead of emotional demand. And for someone who has spent their life equating love with pressure, intensity, or expectation, that feels like a revelation. But here's the deeper layer most people miss. They don't just fall in love with your presence. They fall in love with who they become around you. If being with you doesn't require them to perform, to defend, or to hide, if your love allows them to breathe instead of shrink, then slowly they begin to lower their guard, not because you forced it down, but because they no longer feel the need to protect themselves from you. And ironically, the more you try to force closeness, the more you reinforce their need for distance. But the more you respect their rhythm, the more they begin to step towards you on their own. There's a divine principle at play here. Love cannot be controlled into permanence. It can only be invited into safety. So if you are dealing with someone who pulls away, the question is not, how do I get them to stay closer? The real question is, am I becoming someone who feels safe enough to come back to? Because when an avoidant is truly in love, it doesn't look like constant presence. It looks like return. They leave, but they come back. They test distance, but they reconnect. And every time they return to you and find the same calm, grounded energy, something inside them begins to trust that maybe this connection is different. Not because you demanded loyalty, but because you embodied stability. And here's the truth that can change everything for you. The right love does not require you to chase it into existence. It reveals itself through consistency, patience, and emotional intelligence. If you have to abandon yourself to keep someone close, you are not being chosen, you are being managed. Real love doesn't ask you to shrink, it asks you to stay whole. So if you love someone who is avoidant, don't lose yourself in the pursuit of their closeness. Become someone whose presence feels like peace, not pressure, because the moment they realize they can have love without losing themselves, that is the moment they start to fall in love deeply, quietly, and completely. And sometimes the greatest shift is not getting someone to love you more. It's becoming the kind of love they no longer feel the need to run from. Avoidant individuals don't open up easily, and that's not because they are incapable of love, emotional depth, or connection. In fact, many of them feel things very deeply, but their emotional system is wired in a way that equates closeness with risk rather than comfort. So when they begin to open up, even slightly, it is never random, it is never casual, it is never because of pressure, persuasion, or intensity. It happens because at a very deep subconscious level, they feel something that overrides their usual fear response: safety. And safety, for someone with avoidant tendencies, is not created through grand gestures, emotional speeches, or overwhelming displays of affection. In fact, those things can sometimes do the opposite. Safety is created through emotional consistency. It is created when your words match your actions over time. It is created when you are predictable in your emotional presence, not unpredictable in your need for reassurance or validation. The avoidant nervous system is constantly scanning for emotional volatility because volatility in their past often meant emotional pain, rejection, or loss of control. So when they meet someone who remains steady, even when things are unclear, something begins to shift inside them. This is where most people misunderstand the process. They think opening up is about convincing someone to trust them. But you cannot convince an avoidant to trust you through logic or intensity. Trust is not built in conversations. It is built in experiences. Every interaction either reinforces safety or reinforces danger. When you respond with calmness instead of panic, you are telling their nervous system, without words, that connection with you does not equal emotional overwhelm. When you give them space without withdrawing love, you are telling them that distance does not equal abandonment. And slowly, these repeated experiences start to rewire their emotional expectations. Opening up for them is not a single moment. It is a gradual unfolding. At first, they may share something small, something seemingly insignificant, like a personal preference, a thought from their day, or a mild emotional reaction. To you, it may seem ordinary, but for them, it is a test. Not a conscious test, but an emotional one. Internally, they are asking, if I show a little more of myself, will I still be safe here? Will I still be accepted? Will I still have control over my emotional space? And your response in that moment matters more than anything else. If you react with pressure, questions, or emotional escalation, they retreat. Not because they don't like you, but because their system interprets that response as danger. But if you respond with ease, presence, and non-demanding acceptance, something softens inside them. They begin to associate you with emotional relief instead of emotional pressure. And that association is everything. Over time, these small moments accumulate, and what starts as guarded sharing slowly becomes deeper vulnerability. They begin to reveal thoughts they normally keep hidden. They begin to let you see parts of their emotional world that very few people ever access. But even then, it will not look linear. They will open, then close, move forward, then step back. This push and pull is not manipulation. It is regulation. Their system is learning how to stay connected without feeling overwhelmed. And this is where patience becomes not just a virtue, but a form of emotional intelligence. Because the person who stays consistent without chasing, who remains grounded without reacting to every withdrawal, becomes the person who teaches their nervous system a new definition of love. A definition where closeness does not equal suffocation, and distance does not equal loss. So when an avoidant begins to open up to you, understand that you are witnessing something extremely rare. You are not seeing someone suddenly become different. You are seeing someone feel safe enough, perhaps for the first time in a long time, to let their guard down just a little. And that opening is fragile. It is not maintained by intensity, but by steadiness. Consistency matters more than intensity because intensity speaks to emotions in the moment, while consistency speaks to a nervous system over time. And when you are dealing with someone who has avoidant tendencies, you are not just communicating with their emotions, you are communicating with their conditioning. Their past experiences have taught them that emotional highs are often followed by emotional crashes. That love can feel amazing one day and unsafe the next. So when someone comes in with overwhelming passion, rapid emotional escalation, or sudden intensity, it does not always translate as romance to them. Often it translates as unpredictability. And unpredictability is what their system has learned to protect itself from. So when you show up intensely big declarations, fast attachment, emotional urgency, you may feel like you are proving love, but from their internal world, it can feel like emotional speed without emotional stability. It feels like something that could change quickly, because anything that rises too fast has, in their experience, the potential to fall just as fast. This is why intensity alone rarely creates long-term security for an avoidant person. It might create attraction, it might create curiosity, but it does not create trust. Trust is built in repetition. When you show up consistently, you begin to rewrite their internal expectation of relationships. You become the person who does not change depending on mood, distance, or emotional uncertainty. You become predictable in a healthy way, not boring, but emotionally stable. And to someone who has lived through emotional inconsistency, that stability starts to feel like relief. Consistency says, I am here, even when things are not exciting. Consistency says, I do not disappear when you are distant. Consistency says, I do not punish you for needing space. And over time, these silent messages become more powerful than any emotional speech you could ever give. Intensity, on the other hand, often demands a response. It pushes for matching energy. It seeks immediate validation. And when that validation does not come quickly, it can turn into anxiety, frustration, or withdrawal. For an avoidant, this feels like pressure, not necessarily because the love is wrong, but because the emotional pacing does not match their internal rhythm. Their system needs time to process closeness, time to recalibrate after intimacy, time to feel safe again in their own space. So when you remain steady during those fluctuations, when you do not chase during distance, and you do not overreact during silence, you begin to introduce a new emotional pattern. You show them that connection does not require constant performer, names. You show them that love can exist without urgency, and that is deeply unfamiliar to someone who associates relationships with emotional demands. This is where many people lose the connection without realizing it. They think that if they just love harder, text more, express more, or prove more, the avoidant will finally feel secure. But security is not created by increasing emotional volume. It is created by reducing emotional volatility. It is created by showing up in the same way today, tomorrow, and next week, regardless of whether the connection feels strong or uncertain in the moment. Consistency also builds something even deeper than trust. It builds nervous system familiarity. The avoidant begins to subconsciously recognize your presence as non-threatening. Their body stops preparing for emotional chaos when they hear from you. Their mind stops assuming that every interaction will lead to pressure or expectation. Instead, your presence becomes associated with calmness. And this is where real attachment begins to form. Not because they were convinced, not because they were chased, but because their systems slowly learned that being close to you does not cost them their peace. Intensity can spark interest, but consistency sustains attachment. Intensity can create moments of emotional excitement, but consistency creates emotional safety. And for someone who has spent much of their life protecting themselves from emotional overwhelm, safety is what eventually opens the door to love that is not just felt, but allowed to stay. Space is not rejection for someone with avoidant tendencies. In fact, misunderstanding this single truth is where most emotional disconnection begins. When an avoidant pulls away, most people immediately interpret it through their own emotional framework. They assume distance means loss of interest, fading love, or emotional withdrawal from the relationship itself. So they react emotionally. They reach out more. They ask more questions. They try to close the gap quickly because in their internal world, closeness equals security. But for the avoidant, space is not the opposite of love. Space is how they regulate love. To understand this, you have to step outside the assumption that everyone processes intimacy the same way. Some people move toward closeness when they feel safe. Others need distance in order to feel safe enough to return. The avoidant nervous system becomes overstimulated by prolonged emotional closeness, not because they don't care, but because closeness activates vulnerability faster than they can comfortably process. When emotions become too intense or too fast, their internal system doesn't interpret it as bonding. It interprets it as pressure, and pressure to them triggers withdrawal as a form of self-protection. So when they take space, It is not always a statement about you. It is often a process happening inside them. It is emotional digestion. It is them trying to regulate feelings that feel too big, too fast, or too unfamiliar. But here is where the transformation happens in the relationship. If you understand this and respond correctly, space becomes not a separation, but a bridge. The moment you stop chasing during their withdrawal, you interrupt the cycle that usually reinforces their fear. Because in their past experiences, distance may have often led to pursuit, pressure, or emotional escalation from others. So they learn to associate closeness with obligation and distance with relief. But when you respond differently, when you do not chase, when you do not punish, when you do not emotionally collapse, you introduce a completely new emotional experience. You show them that distance does not equal abandonment. You show them that silence does not equal rejection. And, most importantly, you show them that love does not require constant proximity to exist. This is where emotional safety begins to form. Because now, when they take space, they are not met with fear from the other person. They are met with steadiness. And steadiness is unfamiliar in the best possible way. It creates curiosity instead of panic. It creates reflection instead of avoidance. Over time, their nervous system begins to associate space not with loss of connection, but with the ability to return to connection without consequences. But this only works if you also understand the other side of space. Absence without resentment. Many people say they will give space, but internally they are still attached to anxiety. They are still checking messages, still waiting, still emotionally spiraling. And even if they are not expressing it, that energy is often felt indirectly. The avoidant is highly sensitive to emotional pressure, even when it is unspoken. So true space is not just physical distance, it is emotional non-attachment to immediate outcomes. When you truly give space, you are not stepping away to manipulate return. You are stepping back to preserve peace for both people. You are not withdrawing love, you are withdrawing pressure. And in that environment, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. The avoidant starts to miss without fear. They start to reflect without pressure. They start to feel your absence not as escape, but as contrast. And in that contrast, your presence begins to stand out differently. Because now, you are no longer associated with emotional urgency. You are associated with calm. And calm is something their system eventually gravitates toward, even if it takes time. The deeper truth is that space, when handled correctly, is not the end of connection. It is the refinement of connection. It removes the noise, the pressure, the emotional overreactions, and leaves behind only what is real. And what is real does not disappear in distance. It becomes clearer in it. So when an avoidant pulls away, the most powerful response is not to collapse into fear or chase for reassurance. It is to remain anchored, to allow space without turning it into emotional punishment or emotional pursuit. Because in that balance, you communicate something they may have rarely experienced before, that love can exist without control, and connection can survive without constant proximity. They don't fall in love with words the way most people assume love is built. Words can inspire them, reassure them, or even move them emotionally in the moment. But words alone do not create long-term attachment for someone with avoidant tendencies. In fact, too many words, especially emotional declarations that are not yet matched by lived experience, can sometimes create distance instead of closeness. Because for them, language is easy. Expression can be performed. But emotional safety is something that must be felt repeatedly over time. What they truly fall in love with is emotional experience. Not what you say you are, but what it feels like to be with you. Not the promise of safety, but the actual lived reality of it. Their nervous system is constantly evaluating patterns, not speeches. It is asking silent questions like, do I feel pressured when I am with this person? Do I feel controlled, judged, or emotionally overwhelmed? Or on the opposite side, do I feel calm, accepted, and free to be myself without performance? These questions are not intellectual. They are embodied. They happen through repeated interactions, not conversations. So when you show them consistency in your energy, when your presence feels the same whether they are close or distant, you begin to create a new emotional reference point. You are no longer just someone who speaks about love. You are someone whose presence feels like a different kind of emotional environment, one where they do not have to constantly manage their responses, explain their silence, or defend their need for space. This is where emotional experience becomes more powerful than emotional explanation. For someone avoidant, love is not proven by intensity of expression. It is proven by stability of experience. If being around you feels calm, unpressured, and emotionally safe over time, their system begins to relax, not because they were convinced logically, but because their body starts to stop anticipating threat. And that shift is subtle but profound, because when the body relaxes, emotional openness becomes possible. They also fall in love with how they are allowed to exist around you. This is something most people overlook. It is not just about how you love them, it is about who they are allowed to be in your presence. If they feel like they have to perform emotional availability, respond instantly, or match your emotional pace, they will eventually feel confined. But if they can move naturally, sometimes close, sometimes distant, sometimes expressive, sometimes quiet, without fear of losing connection, they begin to associate you with emotional freedom rather than emotional demand. And emotional freedom is rare for them. So instead of falling for words like "I understand you" or "I will always be here," they begin to fall for the experience of not being pressured when they are silent. They fall for the experience of not being punished, or needing space. They fall for the experience of returning after distance and finding the same calm energy, not emotional resentment or anxiety. This is where emotional imprinting happens. Every interaction, either reinteractions. And over time, it is not the most emotional moments that define the relationship. It is the most consistent ones. The ordinary moments where nothing dramatic is happening, but emotional safety is still present. Those moments build the deepest trust. Even their attraction becomes tied to this experience. They start to notice that around certain people they feel more regulated, more themselves, less guarded, and that feeling begins to override their fear-based patterns, not immediately, but gradually through repetition. Words can create expectation. Experience creates belief. And for someone who has learned to be cautious with emotional vulnerability, belief only forms when experience proves it's safe enough to let their guard down. So if you want to understand how they truly fall in love, it is not through what you say to them in emotional peaks. It is through what they feel in your presence during emotional neutrality. It is in how you respond when nothing dramatic is happening. It is in how safe your energy feels when there is no crisis to solve. Because in the end, they do not attach to the idea of love. They attach to the environment that love creates. If an avoidant becomes deeply attached to someone, it is rarely because of intensity alone. It is not because they were overwhelmed by grand romantic gestures or emotionally swept away in a constant state of high passion. In fact, intensity often does the opposite for them. It triggers their internal alarm system. It activates their need for distance, clarity, and emotional breathing room. So when you see an avoidant who is genuinely, deeply attached, something far more subtle and powerful has been happening underneath the surface. It usually means they have experienced something that contradicts their deepest expectation about relationships. That closeness leads to loss of self, pressure, or emotional suffocation. And instead of confirming that belief, you unintentionally or consistently showed them something different. You showed them that connection can exist without control. That love can exist without emotional overwhelm. That presence does not have to come with pressure. This is not built in dramatic moments. It is built in how you handle the ordinary, the uncertain, and the in-between spaces. It is built in how you respond when they are not fully available, when they need distance, when they are quiet, or when they are emotionally inconsistent. Most people respond to that with anxiety or pressure. They try to fix the distance immediately. They demand clarity. They chase reassurance. But when you respond with emotional steadiness instead of emotional reactivity, something begins to shift in their internal world. They start to notice that being distant does not lead to punishment. They start to notice that needing space does not lead to abandonment or emotional withdrawal from your side. And slowly, without them even realizing it, you become associated with emotional safety rather than emotional demand. That association is everything for an avoidant. Because their attachment system is not broken, it is protective, it is built around self-preservation. So when someone enters their life who does not trigger their survival responses, their system begins to relax in ways they are not used to. And when the system relaxes, attachment becomes possible. Not forced attachment, not anxious attachment, but a quiet, gradual, deeply internal form of connection that builds over time. What makes this attachment so powerful is that it is not based on dependency. It is based on freedom. They do not feel trapped in the connection. They do not feel like they are losing themselves inside it. Instead, they feel like they can move within it. They can come closer when they are ready and step back when they need to, without fear of emotional consequences. And paradoxically, this freedom is what makes them stay closer for longer periods. Because for the first time, closeness does not feel like a threat to their individuality. When this happens, their attachment starts to show in subtle ways. They may not express it loudly or constantly. They may not become emotionally expressive in the way others expect, but you will notice patterns. They return after distance. They check in without being asked. They share more personal thoughts than they used to. They begin to include you in parts of their internal world that were previously closed off. These are not random behaviors. These are signs that their emotional defenses are lowering because they no longer feel the need to protect themselves in the same way. And what caused this shift was not persuasion. It was not emotional intensity. It was the repeated experience of safety without pressure. Another important aspect is that avoidants do not just attach to how you make them feel in moments of closeness. They attach to how you make them feel after closeness. Most relationships create tension after emotional intimacy because of expectation, neediness, or fear of loss. But when someone can experience closeness with you and then experience space without emotional fallout, their nervous system begins to trust the rhythm of the connection. That rhythm becomes the anchor. Over time, they begin to associate you with something rare in their emotional history: stability without restriction. And that combination is what allows attachment to deepen in a way that feels natural rather than forced. They do not feel pulled into you. They feel safe enough to remain near you. So when an avoidant becomes deeply attached, it is not because you overwhelmed them into love. It is because you created a space where they did not have to defend themselves from it. Pressure pushes them away because pressure directly activates the one emotional state they are most sensitive to: the feeling of being emotionally trapped. For someone with avoidant tendencies, closeness is not automatically associated with comfort. It is often associated with expectation, demand, or loss of control. So when emotional intensity starts to feel like urgency, constant texting, repeated reassurance seeking, emotional questioning, or expectations for immediate clarity, their nervous system doesn't interpret it as love. It interprets it as escalation. And escalation in their internal world means exit. But patience works in an entirely different way. Patience is not passive waiting. It is not emotional neglect or indifference. It is the ability to remain steady while allowing emotional timing to unfold naturally. And that difference is everything. Because where pressure says, "I need you to respond to my emotional needs right now," patience says, "I trust that connection does not need to be forced to be real." That message lands very differently in someone whose past experiences have taught them that love often comes with emotional demand. When you are patient, you remove the urgency from the interaction, and without urgency, their internal alarm system has less reason to activate. They no longer feel like they are being pulled into something faster than they can process. Instead, they begin to feel like they have space to approach in their own time. This is where something subtle but powerful begins to happen. The avoidant does not feel chased, so they do not feel the need to escape. And because they do not feel escaped from, they do not feel abandoned either. This emotional neutrality creates a rare internal state where connection can exist without threat. And in that state, curiosity replaces fear, pressure compresses emotional space. It creates urgency, anxiety, and often resistance. Even if your intentions are loving, the emotional experience for them becomes one of suffocation. It feels like someone is standing too close emotionally, expecting a response that they are not internally ready to give. And when that happens repeatedly, their natural defense mechanism is to withdraw further, not because they do not care, but because they need to restore emotional balance. Patience does the opposite. It expands emotional space. It allows them to breathe within the connection without feeling monitored or evaluated. It gives them the psychological room to process their feelings without external demand. And in that space, something important begins to develop: internal willingness instead of external obligation. Because real emotional connection cannot be forced from the outside in. It has to form from the inside out. And patience is what allows that internal formation to take place. When you are patient with someone who is avoidant, you are essentially communicating through. Guard your behavior that their timing is safe with you. You are not punishing their distance. You are not overreacting to their silence. You are not making their emotional rhythm a problem to be fixed. Instead, you are allowing them to experience connection without the fear that it will collapse if they step back. And that experience is rare for them. Most of their emotional conditioning tells them that if they do not maintain closeness actively, they risk losing it. So they either feel pressure to stay engaged or guilt when they need space. But when they encounter someone who does not impose those emotional consequences, something begins to rewire. They start to realize that connection does not always require constant maintenance to survive. This is where trust deepens, not because they are convinced logically, but because their nervous system stops perceiving you as a source of pressure. Over time, patience becomes associated with safety. And safety is the foundation on which they allow themselves to move closer. There is also a deeper layer to patience that many people miss. Patience is not just about waiting for them. It is about not abandoning yourself while you wait. Because true patience is grounded. It is emotionally steady. It does not come from fear of losing someone. It comes from clarity within yourself. And that grounded energy is felt, even without words. When you are grounded, you are not energetically chasing. You are not collapsing into uncertainty. You are simply present. And presence without pressure is one of the most attractive emotional states for someone who is used to emotional intensity followed by emotional withdrawal. Over time, they begin to notice a pattern. With you, nothing is forced, yet nothing is lost. Nothing is rushed, yet nothing disappears. And that consistency without pressure becomes deeply compelling to them because it feels unlike the emotional volatility they are used to. And slowly, without realizing it, they begin to move closer, not because they were pushed, but because they were finally given the emotional freedom to do so. The right kind of love does not require you to abandon yourself in order to keep someone close. It does not demand that you shrink your needs, silence your emotions, or overextend your energy just to maintain a connection. Instead, it reveals something far more grounded and far more aligned with emotional truth. Real love grows in an environment where both people can remain whole. When you are dealing with someone who has avoidant tendencies, this truth becomes even more important, because the natural emotional impulse for many people is to chase closeness when they feel distance, to explain more, to prove more, to adjust themselves more. But in doing so, they slowly begin to lose their own center. And the irony is that the more someone abandons themselves to hold on to another person, the more imbalance they introduce into the connection. Not because love is wrong, but because the dynamic becomes driven by fear instead of mutual stability. The right kind of love does not operate through fear. It operates through presence. Presence means you are emotionally available without being emotionally dependent. It means you can care deeply without collapsing into anxiety. It means you can feel connection without needing constant reassurance to validate it. And when you bring that kind of energy into a relationship, especially with someone who tends to pull away under pressure, something powerful happens. The dynamic begins to shift from pursuit and withdrawal into something more balanced and human. Because what often happens in these dynamics is a cycle. One person reaches, the other retreats. One person intensifies, the other distances, not because either person is wrong, but because their nervous systems are responding differently to closeness. And when that cycle continues, it slowly erodes the sense of safety on both sides. One person feels anxious, the other feels overwhelmed, and neither feels truly free. But when you stop abandoning yourself in the process, you interrupt that cycle. You begin to show that your love is not conditional on constant proximity. You begin to show that your emotional stability is not dependent on their immediate response. And that creates a different kind of relational field, one where connection is not enforced, but allowed. And in that space, something begins to mature. Instead of reacting to every moment of distance, you start observing patterns. Instead of interpreting silence as rejection, you begin to understand rhythm. Instead of chasing emotional certainty, you begin to build internal certainty within yourself. And that internal certainty becomes the anchor of the entire connection. Because the truth is, the right kind of love does not just involve two people finding each other. It involves two people learning how to stay true to themselves while still choosing connection. For someone avoidant, this kind of love is especially transformative because it removes the hidden pressure they often expect in relationships. They are used to emotional expectations building quickly. They are used to closeness turning into demand. So when they encounter someone who does not escalate, does not chase, and does not lose themselves in anxiety, it creates a new emotional reference point. It becomes possible for them to experience connection without feeling controlled by it. And for the other person, this dynamic becomes a lesson in self-respect, because it teaches that love is not proven by how much you sacrifice your inner peace. It is not proven by how much emotional uncertainty you can endure. It is proven by your ability to remain centered even in emotional ambiguity. Over time, this creates a different kind of attraction. Not the kind based on intensity or emotional highs and lows, but the kind based on emotional stability. And stability is what allows love to deepen rather than collapse under pressure. When you remain whole, even while loving someone who pulls away, you are no longer participating in a dynamic of emotional loss. You are participating in a dynamic of emotional awareness. You are no longer trying to force closeness. You are allowing connection to reveal itself through behavior, not desperation. And this is where everything changes. Because the moment you stop shrinking yourself to keep someone, you become someone who can only be met through authenticity, not anxiety. And the right kind of love does not require you to become less of who you are. It meets you in your fullness, respects your boundaries, and grows in a way that feels sustainable rather than exhausting. Thank you for being here and taking the time to reflect on these insights. Wishing you clarity, strength, and peace as you move forward. Goodbye and take care.